Welcome to the Campus Outreach Staffcast, a podcast produced by CO staff for CO staff. I'm your host, Connor Hopkins, along with Campus Outreach Serve's Executive Director, Kent Bailey. We are joined today by the sibling duo Andy Cheely and Becky Kicklighter. They both served on staff with CO for a few years before God moved them into different ministries. Now, they are both back on staff after 2 decades, both serving in different capacities with Campus Outreach Serve. On this episode, we have the privilege of hearing their stories, how parenting plays a crucial role in children's discipleship, and how to cling to Jesus in the difficult seasons of life. Andy and Becky, getting you both in the same room is a real treat, and I think this is going to be a very fun conversation.
Well, if it has to do with campus outreach, then it has to do with laborers. And I really couldn't think of any better examples of laborers than those that we have with us here today. So this is going to be a fun conversation as we talk about what it means to be a laborer and to labor in the lost world. We have Andy Cheely, who is longtime laborer, and we'll get more of his story in just a moment, and Becky Kicklighter as well. And just the opportunity to spend time with them and to hear their stories is a great opportunity. Andy has been a longtime missionary overseas, now back serving here with the Campus Outreach Serve team. Becky was actually on one of the very first expansion teams we had overseas to Australia. And so they're bringing a lot of history, a lot of great example to us in our time here today. But most of all, for me, they're just good friends. So this is fun to be able to have this time together. So why don't you each take just a moment and give us kind of your where you are now and what you're doing, and just family update would be great.
I live with my husband and 3 children in Fort Collins, Colorado now. My husband works for an organization doing their computer services, and I'm mom to my 3 kids. We have 2 with special needs, and I'm a parent CNA for one of those, and then work with CO Serve, spotlighting and amplifying stories of what God's doing around the world through the ministries.
So I'm married to Brooke, and we have 2 daughters. One is a junior in college. She's involved with CO at her university, and our second daughter is a senior in high school and headed to university next year. And I work at the CO Serve Center in Birmingham, Alabama, and I get to participate in a variety of different projects as the Director of Operations.
So I've had the privilege of knowing each of you longer than we want to admit here on the podcast. So we'll just keep that between us, but a long, long time. And so I think it would be great. I just alluded to it a moment ago, just a bit of where you went to college, and then sort of your post-college story, just sort of hitting the high points. So that would be great. What you can actually share publicly would be great.
So I graduated from Troy State University when it was still Troy State University, and went on staff with Campus Outreach straight out of school. I worked with Curtis Tanner in the office, and the preliminary coin office. We had all the little startings there, and did administrative assistant work there. I went on staff at Berry College after that, and was a staff girl there for a few years before going to Australia with the expansion team, and came home from that to get married to Jeremy. We went to seminary and have been working in the world workplace ever since from that.
So I graduated from Troy State University and went on staff with Campus Outreach Birmingham at the time, and worked in Birmingham with some students at Samford and UAB and college students at Briarwood Presbyterian Church. And then left Campus Outreach staff and joined a different organization and went to China. We lived there for a little over 20 years, teaching in universities there and taking the things that we had learned during our time on staff and applying them to that different context. And then in 2017, we finished our work in Asia and came back to the U.S. and rejoined Campus Outreach, joining the Serve team, and have been here in Birmingham for the past 5.5 years.
So Andy, we know obviously that you were involved in Campus Outreach when you were a student at Troy State. Tell us a little bit about that. What was it like getting involved with Campus Outreach? Like, how did you first meet staff with Campus Outreach? And just tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. Troy was really almost the 3rd university that Campus Outreach had a ministry on, Samford to Montevallo and to Troy. And so when I got there as a freshman, there were guys in the senior class that had been part of that first wave of what God had started to do at Troy. My dad dropped me off at the university. I still had cardboard boxes in the dorm room, and he drove off. And about an hour later, a guy knocked on the door and introduced himself with Campus Outreach. He was a staff guy. And invited me to be part of a freshman Bible study. And so I was involved and engaged literally from day one. And it was the campus director. At that time, the number of staff on campuses were a lot fewer than we typically have now. So there was one campus staff guy, one campus staff woman. Yeah, so I was involved throughout the course of those 4 years. That freshman Bible study ended up turning into a discipleship relationship with that guy. Did 2 summer leadership projects, went on a cross-cultural project after my junior year to Bangkok, Thailand, and then was really encouraged and surprised to be invited to join staff at that point. So that's how I got involved and how I got engaged. My very first semester, actually, some of those senior guys challenged our freshman Bible study to a scripture memory competition throughout the quarter. So Peter and myself and some other guys, we tried to memorize the Navigator topical memory system, the first packet of verses. And then at the end of the semester, the senior guys came in. And so we went back and forth, and you had to be word perfect, of course, with the verse reference before and after. And every time you got one right, you got a point. If you missed a word or missed a reference, you didn't get the point or whatnot. And whoever won had to buy the other group steak dinner. I think we killed them.
Pretty much.
That's a very creative way to do scripture memory. That's
right.
For sure.
That's right.
But it sounds very effective.
Those verses are still in there. Let me tell you, I can still pull those out. So it's really great.
The earthly reward was great, but the heavenly reward was even greater, but helps to have the earthly treat as
That's
well.
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So Becky, tell us a little bit about what it was like for you to go to Troy. What drew you there in the first place? Just tell us a little bit about that process.
The fact that I watched Andy's life, to be honest. And so, but I watched Andy go off to college and watched his life change. And we'd always had a fine relationship, but just watched him mature and grow. And I wanted whatever was affecting him and helping him grow. I wanted the same thing in my life. So I wasn't committed to going to Troy to get that, but I figured out it was campus outreach that was influencing him. And so I just decided I was only going to apply to colleges where that ministry was there. And at that time, that just meant either West Georgia or Troy were the 2 that I was going to apply to. Yeah. And as soon as I got there, that was what I was most excited about. Some people want to go to Rush. Some people want to do other things. I wanted to go to a campus outreach meeting and find out what the big deal was.
So I'd love to hear from each of you just what's the impression you had or the things maybe you learned early on from Reverend Barker and from Barbara that just made a lasting impression on you.
It's interesting. We've talked about this a little bit amongst ourselves. We don't have a typical campus outreach staff answer to this question. For us, Dr. Barker was our pastor. A lot of CO staff, as they met Frank and Barbara or would encounter them, it would be at a New Year's conference or at a staff training. And so there was this otherness to them, or it was before celebrity pastor culture existed. And I don't know that anybody ever necessarily put Frank and Barbara on a pedestal like some of those things. But for us, he never entered into that category because he was our church pastor. Our father was a minister. And so we grew up in a ministry environment for our whole life. And so when we came to Birmingham and came to Briarwood, that was the waters that we swam in, was just ministry and church. Our family was involved in a social dynamic within the church staff, to the point we laugh about the fact that when we first got here, the pastoral families still had to do performances at the Christmas service every Sunday night. And so we were horrified. We had to sing a song or play the piano or do something. That wasn't to entertain the congregation, but it was an attempt at connecting with the congregation from the pastoral staff level. And Frank and Barbara and Frank and Anita and Peggy were part of that as well. So there was just a normalcy to that relationship that colors and influences all of our impressions of him. One of my key memories of Frank was going to him as my pastor when I came back from, I think it was my second summer project. And some of the things that God had done had been shaping my life around. There had been such an impact of spiritual growth in those first 2 years at college. And the typical campus outreach student testimony is, I thought I was a Christian. I got to church, I got to college, became a Christian, or I wasn't a Christian, got to college and became a Christian. And there was a lot of growth that happened in my life, so much so that it cast doubts on what had happened earlier in my life. And so I was really wrestling through because, you have to write your testimony. You have to communicate your testimony with people. And so wrestling with my pastor over, was I a Christian before? And did I just become a Christian? Or is there something else that's happened here? And Dr. Barker was very, very patient. Again, a congregation the size of his typically would think, well, the senior high pastor or the college pastor would deal with that. But he sat down and interacted with me over it to the point I still remember it. It was very influential. And he actually helped me come up with a framework that explained some of the work that God had been doing that has propelled me in the next 30 years of my life to understand how God has continued to work in my life and continued to have seasons of radical growth and then periods where it hasn't been as explosive. But it doesn't mean each time that new explosive growth has happened, oh, maybe I wasn't a Christian to start with. And it was just really a framework of sanctification that has propelled me forward in my walk and has given me freedom to share my testimony in environments and situations with non-believers and people who think they're believers as well with a greater degree of sensitivity.
Well, we moved here when I was 12. And so my initial impression of Frank was, I just thought he was just another man like my dad, to be honest. He was just so humble and personable. I mean, not in any way outgoing, but was always willing to talk to whoever was there. So I just felt like he was a normal man, which affected my life greatly because he was a normal man who shared the gospel when he had the opportunity, and he encouraged people. He encouraged their visions, their dreams, things like that. It was just a part of who he was. And so he was just our pastor who did that.
Well, you both have alluded to your dad, who was just as well such a dear person in my life and friend. And we often talk about campus outreach and its legacy of the things that were important at Briarwood being so influential in the ministry. And a big part of that is a heart for the world. And certainly that was Reverend Barker's heart. But when it came to implementing and expanding that vision, it was really Tom who was doing that. Someone told me once that there were only 3 missions pastors in the whole country when Frank challenged him to come here and be the missions pastor of Briarwood. So I know you guys could talk all day long about his impact on your life as your father, but I'd love to hear from a ministry standpoint, from a heart for the world standpoint, what's sort of the enduring legacy from your father that you got from him in terms of a heart for the world?
Much like the conversation about Frank, so much of the impact that mom and dad have had in our life came about what is more that was caught and taught. And so dad made his first overseas missions trip when we were in elementary school. We were living in North Carolina. He took a group of carpenters and insurance salesmen from this small congregation in North Carolina to Irian Jaya in Papua New Guinea, up the Sepik River in dugout canoes to work with this Wycliffe Bible translator. We had seen a film. They had gone there, had translated the scriptures, and God had done a move among these people and planted a church. And they needed help building a school and building a church building. And so they went there. And dad came back a changed person. The congregation was changed. And so that was, one of the most significant things in our experience, to see that impact of the world pictured for us on the screen and then pictured for us. They brought back spears and they brought back bows and arrows and slides to show to the congregation. And then it became normal to have missionaries in our church, missionaries in our home. I think for both of us, we would say, back to the ecosystem again, the world and God's heart for the world just became part of the air that we breathed. And we didn't realize until we moved into other contexts, like going away to college, that was atypical. In the same way that we would say, well, we thought guys like our dad, who had been our pastor up until we came to Briarwood, and then Frank, we thought those were the type of men that all pastors were, and churches all thought about the world that way. And then we found out, actually, there are pastors who don't have those same priorities, or there are churches that don't have those same priority structures. That was jarring, I guess, to us to a degree. And then CO helped bring the taught part to what had been caught, where our parents had given us the environment for it. Kent, as my campus director, and the summer projects put systems and structures to what we had intuitively or instinctively had picked up from our folks and from Briarwood. And we need both of those. I think every person does. And in some cases, families can do the teaching and the ecosystem environment, but not always. I think those are challenging dynamics.
It really was such a normal thing. I gave up my bed all the time and had to sleep in bunk beds in Andy's room because we had missionaries staying in our home. And Daddy used to say, this is why we do what we do. People talk about that quote from him, but that's really how we lived our life. That we did what we did because people around the world needed to know Jesus. But I do remember distinctly realizing what that meant for my neighbor as well. We lived in South Carolina for a while, and our life was so in the church. They were our family. They were our people. And we went to school there, and I realized my friends there didn't know Jesus. They didn't go to our church. And all of a sudden it hit me, it's not just the people overseas, but it's also the people next door. And so how that developed and grew. But my mom gave me a book to study, to spend time with Jesus every day. But that's all that's what she knew how to do. And as Andy was saying, when we went off to college, then somebody came alongside of me and showed me how to study God's word for myself in a deeper and more detailed way. And I'm just so grateful because what that's happened is done. So I got training in college through the ministry. Now with my children, I can do a lot of the training that my parents did not have the training to do. So I can do those practical things Andy was talking about and sit down with my children and show them how to do what I learned to a deeper and further extent than my parents have been trained to do. So I'm so thankful. It was just such a foundational part of my life.
That's awesome because you guys really could not distinguish between your home and your ministry, which really is the question I wanted to get to, because, we're talking here among ourselves. And I know one of the concerns that many staff people have are their children, the impact that being in ministry is going to have on their children. Your parents were on staff at churches, pastoring and then associate pastoring. And so you've had that whole experience. And so obviously it was shaping to you. So I'd love to hear what you would say to staff people everywhere who are in ministry and extremely busy with the commitments they have there, and they have a family. I'd love for you each just to share a word of encouragement or even an example of how that has shaped your life to have grown up in a ministry home. And then now you're having your own ministry home as well. Just what would you say to staff?
In Psalms 27:13, I wrote this down. It says, I certainly believe that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I feel like that is what my growing up in my home with my parents really did. I just assumed that I would see the Lord at work. And because I was surrounded with stories, my best friend growing up, her mother was a nurse. And at dinner, they would talk about what happened in the emergency room. And it was just normal for Heather. It grossed me out. But Heather, they just talked about those things and it was normal. At our house, we talked about people in other countries who were coming to know Jesus. We talked about people who couldn't walk and then they could. We talked about all these things and it just became my expectation to see those things. So as I've gone into my own life and in my own home, I am looking for those things as well and wanting my children to look for those things as well and see God at work around them. It's very different than the life I grew up in, but I want them to see where he's growing up. Last week, I had shared with my daughter that I'd seen a new tool for sharing the gospel. With my job here with Campus Outreach Serve now, I've been exposed to things that are 20 years of not being involved. I've learned some new tools. So I'd asked this gentleman if he would share with me how it worked. And he sent me a YouTube video to watch, which is a whole new world too. And then so I'm telling Katie Blythe that I told him, I'm building laborers here in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I think that this tool would really help them to be able to share their faith with their friends. And Katie Blythe looked at me and said, you're building laborers in Fort Collins, Colorado? And I was like, well, yeah. She said, wait, do you mean me? And I said, well, yes, I am. So prayerfully, I'll be teaching her things that she can take, and then she'll be expecting to see the Lord at work as well. And it'll just be a natural part of the outflow of her life as well.
We have two daughters, and they were born in Asia. They grew up in Asia, and we moved to the States a few years ago. They haven't had the opportunity to go back because of the COVID pandemic. The country, China's been very restrictive and locked down. And so we had anticipated by this point, we would have had a chance to go back and visit home for them. And they haven't been able to do that. And so there's a combination of challenges as they're navigating the waters of changing cultures. They're also moving into that stage of life where they're having to own their faith for themselves. And it's been a tricky dynamic to sort out what is Chinese and American, what is their identity as believers or as followers of Christ, and what's their parents. Those are challenges for all of us. One of the verses I go back to is in Psalm 5. The psalmist says, Lord, would your favor cover us like a shield? Regardless of the level of covenantal theology one would hold to, God does favor his family. He favors his children. And there's not a promise that our children will become his children, but he does show favor to his children. And so as his child, my prayer to him is that he would cover my girls with his favor like a shield, because I did grow up in a ministry environment. The very first job I ever got was working at a hardware store in high school. Now, there were some guys who were starting this hardware store, and they sent a message to the high school that I went to and asked for some guys who would be willing to work part-time. And so 4 of us responded to the job offer. They were very reluctant to hire me because I was a preacher's kid, and the stereotypes of ministry children were such that they were loath to do it, but they only had 4 respond, and they needed 4 guys to help get the store set up. By God's grace and mercy, I didn't fit the stereotypes of full-time vocational ministry people. But I do recognize that there are aspects where it can be dangerous and can be challenging. And it's just a hard line And I think it requires great humility for those of us in full-time ministry to live without a deserving mentality. Like, hey, I've earned this. God owes me this, or the people in the church owe me this, or my supporters owe me this. None of those things are true. What we deserve is death and hell and separation from God. Everything else is grace. And so living in that posture is a challenging thing to do when it comes to our family. It's one thing for me to say, well, I'll go to another country, or I'll live in a small apartment, or I'll live at this income level, but to ask my spouse to do it or to ask my children to do it. But he calls us as a family. He doesn't just call me. And so we have always operated off the thing. This is the Chile family team, and he's called all of us to the ministry situation he's put us in. And so I do have to be sensitive to the roles and the way he's designed the children. Much like Becky would say, it became normal. She saw these things, and so it became an expectation in her own life. I do believe that we're called to lay a foundation in our children's lives, not just of knowledge and catechism, but also of the experience of what it means to walk with God and see him actively involved in our lives. And so as they wrestle with the faith on their own, as they become young adults, they can't get away from what they've seen and what it means to see God actively answer prayer. You can't just dismiss that. Well, you can, but it takes work, effort, and intentionality, and they have to make those choices. So in the same way that Jim Elliott would say, I want to be a fork in the road. Anybody who wants to get to hell has got to choose to get around me. I want to do that for my children, not so much from a propositional standpoint, but from a personal life and the experiences that they have watched the kingdom of God advance in our living room, not just in the dorm rooms or in the cafeterias, but in our living room as well. But it's not neat and clean. And I think a lot of us want guarantees, or we want it to be boxed in real neatly and nicely. It's a messy, broken world, but he is faithful. He's always faithful, and he's always good. I always go back to Mike Heron's story. When Mike was at West Georgia, his parents, his in-laws, other people kept asking when he was going to get a real job. And he said, I have a job. I said, yeah, they were living in that ratty rental house near campus. And, it was very, very hard life. And Keith was born. And then it was like, okay, well, now you got a kid. So now surely you'll get a real job. How are you going to pay for college? That was the question. How are you going to pay for college for Keith? Mike didn't know. He didn't have enough money to save for it. He didn't know. But when you fast forward to when he's telling the story, and God provided a full ride scholarship to Georgia Tech for Keith. And everybody cheered and clapped at the staff conference. And Mike said, no, wait, stop. That's not the point. Because I could have quit being in ministry and gone and saved enough money to pay for college. Paying for college was never really the problem. The issue is God provided through a scholarship in the same way he could have provided through savings. But when Keith got to Georgia Tech, Clint Watson was able to walk down the hall and knock on his dorm door and invite him to be in a Bible study, because Clint Watson was a laborer because he'd been introduced to Christ and trained by Mike at West Georgia. And if he'd quit his job and gone and gotten a job to save money, he could have paid for college, but there would have been no laborer there. And I just think that is the quintessential issue. We're the laborers, and we're not going to find them if our fixation is providing for our families. The fixation for providing for our families is seeing them experience the beauty of God and the reality of God and the graciousness of God and the goodness of God, even in hard times. In fact, that's when we know he's good. He's a good shepherd because he lays down his life for the sheep. And we experience that when life is hard. If it's always good, then who knows if God's good or not? It's when life is hard and he's good. It's clear, it's brighter, it's saltier. The blood of the Lamb through the gospel and the word of the testimony of his followers helps us persevere through difficult days.
We're going to take a break from our conversation and transition into our movement spotlight. In each episode, we will take a minute to hear an update from a CO region and share their prayer requests. In today's movement spotlight, we will hear from CO Brisbane, Australia. They write, God has provided for our staff team by supplying extra staff, and it's been a breath of fresh air. He has also given us great favor at the colleges where we are doing ministry. 2 of the colleges at the University of Queensland are now places where we know a lot of students and can quite freely enter into and do ministry. We've had some first years in a Bible study from the start of the year, and they're now starting to take on some responsibility and ownership of the ministry. We've also got a number of students reading the Bible and investigating Christianity for themselves. We've just had Summer Beach Project, and there were around 25 students who came, including some who aren't yet believing in Jesus. Let's join them in praying that God would give continued favor and increased momentum at the colleges next year, that they would be able to meet any first years who are Christians, and that they would be able to continue to do evangelism in those spaces. Let's also specifically join them in praying that God would save these students who are in the ministry and investigating what Christians believe.
Becky, you sort of just alluded to something earlier that I'd like to go back to and hit on, and that is just your children with special needs. And Andy, you also alluded to what can easily be sort of the deserving mentality of, we're in full-time ministry and shouldn't have these challenges. And every family has challenges. It may be as a special needs child, or maybe it's something else that's taking place. I'd love to hear from each of you just how you have not distinguished between those things, but just said, no, there are challenges that come and we build laborers in the context of those challenges. Maybe how you've done that, what God has used to help you to persevere, to walk with him and influence all those that you're around, including your family, even in tough times.
I would say one thing that comes to mind is that the seasons of life look so different, and having Lily has been a real help in leaning into that and living into that. There was a time when Lily and Thomas were really small that building laborers was focused. It was only at home.
Solely on them. That's
solely
right.
with my kids.
That's right.
We were doing therapies all day and things like that. There was just so much at home that's what the time looked like. And just in the last few years, really, it's been interesting to watch because our life has gotten to a place where we can start looking outside of our home more and more to how Lord wants to use us in his kingdom, and just being okay with that, realizing that that's the calling is different at different times, and how he uses them to be a part of that has been really exciting. So seeing Lily in the church is a beautiful picture to watch because Lily has a brain malformation. So she is 18 years old, but she relates more like she's 4 or 5. But we've always prayed that she would be a joy and bring light wherever she is. And that is what she does. And going back to what Andy had said earlier about more is caught than taught, hearing her speak the things that she's heard at home and own those as her own in her own simple way has been beautiful. So it goes back to, though, the foundation that was laid, that the Lord gave Lily to us for a purpose. She is part of our story and part of our journey. And how does he want to use her and his overarching story to bring glory to himself? So one of the things I really value about my time with Campus Outreach as a student and staff was that we were taught principles that we apply in different ways. And if that had not been the case, if we had just been taught application, it would have fallen apart as soon as Lily couldn't walk. But the fact that we were taught principles, those things play out in our life in different ways than I could have ever imagined, but I can still go back to that truth. And I'm very grateful for that because discipleship looks different when you're influencing a church. And that's what the Lord's done. He's used our family to influence our little tiny church in Fort Collins because they've never had a reason to love this type of person or to see if that kind of person could really understand the gospel. And Lily's so cute because every Sunday they invite you to the table and they say, those of you who have been baptized and long to follow Jesus. And she out loud, Dad, I was baptized. Yes, you were, dear. There's a whisper. And then I long to follow Jesus. Is he talking about me? And just the whole church hears that and then has to wrestle with their own place with that and how they deal with her.
And then when you get there, they say, the body of Christ broken for you, the blood of Christ shed for you. And Lily always goes, thank you so much.
And she curtsies every Sunday.
But the posture of, gratitude, humility, and worship.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
That is a great point. And that's what our hope is for this podcast, is that we're sharing stories. And you guys have helped us so much in doing that today, just giving examples of what it means to be a laborer and to build laborers. So that's exciting. As the initial focus for us here is going to be this going out to staff people around the world, many of whom are facing huge challenges in this season. Is there a word of encouragement you would give to them just as we wrap up here around building laborers, around being a laborer, around walking with Jesus? Is there sort of a word of encouragement you'd want to give to them today as they're out there seeking to know God more and to share his love with people around the world? What would you say to them today?
I would say the Lord who had called you is faithful and he will do it. And one of the greatest joys about coming back to staff with Campus Outreach Serve has been to see the fruit of what God's done over those 30 whatever years that I've been away from Campus Outreach Ministry. So I've been away for 20 years of from the ministry itself, but engaging with people and hearing the prayers that we prayed at Berry College in 1995. And then I meet Bob McGregor down the hall, who is a product of the ministry at Berry College and went on to work overseas for 10 years. The Lord answered prayers from 20 to 30 years ago. I mean, I'm an answer to somebody's prayer, but still, you guys who are on campus staff now may not see immediate results, but what the Lord could potentially do over the next 20 to 30 years is just, it works. It'll happen. It's not just something you're telling people on campus. It really works. And so not to lose sight of that and lose hope, but to press on.
I think keep your eyes on Jesus. He is worth all of this. Even the ministry fruitfulness is not worth it. It may not show up. You may not get a chance to see it. Maybe you get reconnected in 20 years and see it, but maybe not. And if the fruitfulness is the focus, if the effectiveness is the focus, I think you'll find yourself burned out and dry, because there's never enough. There's always more need, but Jesus is always enough. Jesus is worth the sacrifices and the joys. He's the greater joy than any joy that fruitfulness would produce. And he's deeper than any struggle or sacrifice that we might make in light of the work. As we've navigated these decades of walking with him and laboring, it's really him that's worth all of it. And if we get our eyes off of the author and perfecter of our faith, then I think we're on a short road to discouragement or difficulty or burnout or fear or all these other things. When he is all that we are pursuing and seeking, everything else is a light momentary affliction in comparison.
That Luke 10 reminder of don't rejoice merely that the demons are subject to Jesus' name, but rejoice that you know Jesus, that your name is written in the book of life. Thank you, Andy. That's such a great reminder. And Becky, thank you for all that you've shared. This has been just a joy to sit with friends and hear stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Campus Outreach Staffcast. If you enjoyed the show, stay up to date by subscribing on your favorite podcasting app so you can receive updates when new episodes are released. On the next edition, we will hear from Alan Worthington, who shares about his incredible story, being faithful to God in a secular job, and investing in the kingdom however he can. Until then, God bless.